Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to my talk titled The National Health and Medical Nemesis, in which I'm going to talk about a very nice theatrical play, which also has a very nice film adaptation titled The National Health, and later on discuss a very nice concept of medical nemesis, developed by a very interesting person of Ivan Illich. Let's go. Okay, so National Health is a theatrical play written in 1969 by Peter Nichols. And it's basically about the dreary day-to-day reality at the wards of an understaffed NHS hospital. As I've said, it's been written in 1969, so we could say that it was a period when the British welfare state and also the NHS was at its heyday, at its highest prestige, when since NHS has been grounded in 48 by Nijbeven, that this institution had the most funding and so on and so forth. And importantly, it's also based on Nichols's personal experiences with the NHS, his stay at the hospital. You might also know Peter Nichols, for instance, from the play A Day in the Death of Joe Egg, also a great one. Just saying so, they might elucidate who this person is. This play has also got a very nice film adaptation over here, 1973, cadres from which I'd extensively use in my presentation. So the National Health consists of two main plot lines: the National Health and Nurse Norton's Affair. Basically, the main plot line is situated at the wards of this underfunded NHS hospital. It depicts the scarcity that both the patients and the staff are facing, the absurd situations that materialize, the conflicts and interactions between patients from all social strata, which is intertwined with, as you can see this plotline is intertwined and contrasted with a soap opera-like romance story of doctors and nurses at a high-tech hospital where scarcity seems to be virtually purged from it. The plot is exaggeratedly cliche with a happy ending, which is a clear spoof of contemporary American hospital telenovelas from the time. And this interlude also has an interesting position within the play and the film. As you can see in the bottom left corner, there are some cues that this soap opera interlude is what the patients are watching at the hospital television, and that's indeed it's a telenovela, just simply as it is. But simultaneously, you might not see it at these cadres, but the actors which star in this telenovela are basically alter egos of staff members from the wards. So we also get cues that it's an escapist vision, which one of the staff members actively envisions. So obviously the scarcity, the shortages and absurds of the NHS are patent in this film. I would be far from viewing it as a smug critique that giving freebies doesn't work. As well, the alternative, this soap opera is also clearly ridiculed as just a dream. You literally have to have so much money to afford this, to live this dream. So either way, you get scarcity for everyone, plenitude for the few. Either way, you get a more or less tragical farce. The world is presented as a place full of contradictions, while sometimes limited resources seem to be a cause of absurd situations. Simultaneously, many clinical interventions seem futile and excessive. For instance, when one of the patients, I won't spoil which one, also there will be some spoilers, so be wary. When one of the patients is found lying dead in his bed, like a massive action, just lots of doctors, nurses, other members of staff, defibrillators, oxygen tanks, all this specialist equipment is mobilized to resuscitate him in a very hectic and frantic action, even though, well, the patient seems well dead even before the resuscitation started. So simultaneously, there is scarcity and excess. It's much more complicated. There seems to be thus a more constitutive limit to medicine, to medical practice, a constitutive mismatch between what it can possibly provide and what is systematically demanded of it. These concepts might have had some resonance, most notably in the person of Ivan Illich, who is a super interesting person. He, as a jack of all trades, he's studied histology, he studied history, I believe, but ultimately he joined the seminar and became a priest and missionary. He spoke also 8 languages fluently, at least. But he, eventually became a renegade. He fell out with the church on multiple occasions. For instance, once when he was a missionary in Puerto Rico, he supported a politician who campaigned for widespread access to contraceptives, for which he got significant reproach from the church. And eventually he became very critical of the church as an institution, that, well, it corrupts the idea of salvation by promising it as something it can be provided en masse by. He criticized the standardization of it, and so on. And this critique also kind of overlaps. It's kind of dissipated into other areas, most notably modernity and technology in general, and its tendency to homogenize, to lose. And yeah, we could plug it into critical theory, Adorno Horkheimer critique. But he also famously is one of the most radical critics of medicine. In his book, Limits to Medicine, Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health, from 1975, he contends, for instance, not without reference to evidence, that the success of medicine is pretty overstated, that the development of vaccines, antibiotics, and especially the more high-tech medical procedures is not correlated with increases in public health statistics, in life expectancy, life quality, much less than more quotidian advances such as improved housing, nutrition, hygiene, so things that maybe are not necessarily medical. Importantly, though, when Illich talks about health, he defines it as a personal capability to cope with an illness, with an experience of pain, with a distress, by making sense of the circumstances from which it emerged. So quite importantly, health is not merely a static equilibrium, but it also has a virtual component. To use Nick J. Fox's terms, it's not about what a body is, but about what a body can become. Health is thus not merely, furthermore, not merely the absence of a biomedical illness. It's not something constrained to our biomedical body, but very embedded in every individual's particular social environment. It is therefore, once again, a very particular and situational quality that cannot get reduced to standardized parameters. Thus, a tension arises between the heterogeneous and embedded nature of health and, well, the homogenizing tendency of modern medicine to quote Illich, turn healthcare into a standardized item, either a commodity in the private healthcare system or a right in a more socialized healthcare system. And not only is thus for Illich medicine's contribution to health questionable, but the production of ill health is also systemically inscribed in the very structure of medicine. As, well, modern medicine, it makes people unhealthily dependent on itself. It makes people reach out to the help of medicine first without first trying to deal with their issues in their own aspect, and thus it makes people dependent. And well, once again, health is a capability to cope, which is lost in the process. Thus, one of the central categories for Illich is iatrogenesis, which basically means that when therapy is a source of ill health, which not only for him has a clinical component, which would be simply, well, when the direct side effects of a therapy make you ill, but also social, which is when the progressing medicalization of society, that more and more areas of life are mediated by the institution of medicine, that are more often referred to in medical terms. It's also transforms social links in a way which contributes to the hegemony, to the radical monopoly of medicine. And ultimately, there's the cultural level, which is at the level of episteme. It is at the level of what can we think about medicine, of all the cultural codes which mediate our conceptualization of the ill health that we experience, the pain that we experience. And what seems to make iatrogenesis systemic in modern medicine, and also a self-perpetuating dynamic, is the dynamic of medical nemesis, which quite importantly has a mythological connotation, as nemesis in Greek mythology was the punishment bestowed upon the tragic hero for hubris, so for daring to challenge the boundaries set by gods, by nature, and so on and so forth. Except for Illich, in the modern technological society, nemesis is not a condition of the tragic hero. Rather, it's the condition of the everyman. As we all push against nature's border, we subject ourselves to more and more treatment in order to whisk the pain away. Medical nemesis thus designates for Illich two things. First of all, it's a dynamic of this vicious cycle that illness leads to treatment, which leads to iatrogenesis, which leads to further ill health, which leads to further treatment, and the cycle perpetuates itself. We reach out to medicine even though it makes us sicker, but also it's this effect of technological hubris that we subject to medical nemesis in order to nurture it, in order to render ourselves oblivious to facing this limit of medicine. It's kind of a rush that we subject ourselves to. Thus, I'd like to read Ivan Illich. As we'll find out later on, it allows to bypass some pitfalls that his theory provides, to read Ivan Illich through the framework of Deleuze and Guattari as a desire, so as a process of production, like Deleuze and Guattari say, all production is desiring production. So it's desire is something which makes you become, which deterritorializes, it changes, reassembles links between entities, so that something new keeps emerging, but in an Oedipal desire, it nevertheless is subjected to a certain limit. Here, in case of medicine, it would be that pain, which for Illich is always a situated response, is a meaningful communicate, which has to be taken account of. However, he accuses medicine of treating pain as a transcendent evil, which has to be purged, but at all costs. Obviously, the only solution for that can be modern, sophisticated medicine. So here, medicine, the biomedical model, becomes introduced as an Oedipal code to which all experiences of pain have to refer. And as I said, it does deterritorialize, as for instance, progressive medicalization transforms social links, the ways we think about illness. So here's a significant transformation. But well, now a prime victim of medical nemesis in the national health seems to be this character, not the doctor who falls asleep from overwork on Mackie, but yeah, Mackie is the one who's lying there. Who's an elderly man who suffers from terminal cancer and depends on opioids to cope with pain. He views thus his life as meaningless and wants a voluntary euthanasia, which is even nowadays prohibited by UK law. UK seems to be pretty tough on all types of end-of-life care in this respect. Thus, Mackie considers himself to be kept alive against his will, which seems to be medical nemesis par excellence. He wants to live no more. He doesn't want to live anymore in this planned and engineered health, to quote Illich once again. But once again, it is a bit ambiguous. He nevertheless wants this death to be peaceful. He nevertheless wants it's quite bent on accessing medicine. The medical nemesis is still something living in this state which Mackie seems to desire at some point. It's a relation which he stays in. Yeah, out of all patients, he's thus unsurprisingly the one that's the most critical of British health of the healthcare service. And he also most overtly questions the assumption that, well, life has an intrinsic meaning, just the pure biomedical life. Giorgio Agamben's Zoe, perhaps the bare life, just the very act of being alive for him, well, it's not necessarily meaningful. It's not necessarily that just by the very merit of saving a life, we're doing something good and it's all right. No, for him, only good life is valuable. Except, well, he does eventually lapse into a racist and conservative rhetoric by advocating mass euthanasia for the deplorables. He is also quite racist at times. He's still and so on. So that's a tricky question. He seems to be acutely aware of the limits of medicine, but at some point he drifts away, and that's also an interesting thing that I should discuss later on. On the other hand, polarly opposite to Mackie's attitudes towards medicine, and precisely because of that identical in several aspects, are those of Foster. His class position seems interesting. It's how it's depicted in the film and in the play. I think it does matter. It does it does explain for his positions. Does allow it to situate them as. In the play, we know that he's a trained signalman, so which is is a, so he'd be a wage laborer, maybe which doesn't maybe earn the which earns a bit more than the minimum wage, so he wouldn't be too wealthy, but nevertheless he'd afford to procure for some free time, for some cultural social capital in this aspect, especially as, well, he quite often boasts about how successful and virtuous life he leads, that he's got a loving family, that he trains sports regularly. But, well, the question of his occupation is elided in the film, and indeed his dressing gown in the film seems to be a bit posher, so that's a bit ambiguous. Nevertheless, he self-identifies with working class when there's a discussion about how he has been to a palace. He's eager to affirm that, well, his ancestors would have lived where the servants used to. And yeah, and he's furthermore a self-proclaimed socialist, but not a communist. I don't agree with the extremes, says Foster, and if the communists came over, I'll fight them. So he does seem to maybe embody the spirit of the British welfare state, of the social democratic capitalism at the time. He's unsurprisingly very fond of the NHS, which he recognizes as important to British welfare state, but sometimes uncritically. For instance, he often seems to fetishize the NHS as something good in itself, just like Mackie fetishizes his own projections of the primitive times when the balance of nature was kept and the scum of the earth would just die away. They wouldn't be kept alive. But Foster also is a bit problematic in this aspect, as at his least agreeable, he laughs at troublesome patients when they're disciplined by staff. So he kind of seems to enjoy the position of power that being a virtuous patient bestows upon him. He also patronizingly fetishizes an elderly and frail patient for merely succeeding to stay alive. He's like, yeah, good job. That's the spirit, even though like that's also clearly a bit oblivious of the privilege he has. And in that aspect, although seemingly content with his life and his hospital stay, he can be considered a victim, if not a perpetrator, of medical nemesis, as he conspires to produce, as if it were a commodity, a better health. To once again quote Illich, medical nemesis seems to re-territorialize and essentialize him, limiting what he can become, think, desire. He becomes even more firmly rooted in his ego of this virtuous citizen with a concern for social matters. The difference in perspectives on medicine between these two characters, as well as the ways in which they enact their own medical nemesis, appears thus to be significantly embodied in their habitus, the nature of their illness, and so on and so forth. Unsurprisingly, maybe also given Illich's conception of health as an extremely situated condition. Thus, already having briefly compared to these two characters, medical nemesis appears to be a phenomenon whose concrete materializations are extremely heterogeneous because of this physical and social embodiment of illness. So that indeed, once again, to quote Illich, medical nemesis cannot be measured, but its experience can be shared. We know that medical nemesis is there, but what else actually can we say about medical nemesis? Indeed, this poses questions about the applicability of medical nemesis as category of reference when discussing the limits of medicine. It might be useful to diagnose particular manifestations of medical nemesis and analyze the assemblage from which it's crystallized, but can it really be used to make broad and totalizing claims about the nature of medicine? Especially as aforementioned, individuals' attitude towards health and medicine are largely shaped by socio-economical factors external to medical practice. Indeed, Illich has been reproached quite a bit for constructing a homogenized view of medicine, despite the fact that even especially from a more post-structuralist perspective, power relationships enacted by medical power are extremely diffuse. I do not think that this interpretation, this picture of medicine as a monolith, is necessarily implied by Illich, and I think that reading medical nemesis as a flow of desire allows to alight this pitfall, but nevertheless it is a pitfall that we should beware of. And this pitfall seems also well embodied in the position of Mackie, the conservative revolutionary. Although he might be right to criticize the assumption about health that guide medical practice for being reductive, for just valuing the bare health, the bare life without its context. In his calls for mass euthanasia, he nevertheless affirms the possibility of a unified measure for a value of life. There must, when he's asked, well, who'll determine who is to live and who will not, he just says someone will have to, as if he affirmed that there is indeed an unproblematic way to go beyond this. Thus, even if the criteria by which Mackie defines health might echo somehow those of Illich, insofar, well, once Mackie starts using them as a universal standard, that's the crucial point, he lapses into the homogenizing tendency of medicine that Illich decries. His experience of medicine and medical nemesis might be symptomatic of medicine going against nature's limit, but this limit is highly situational. The multiple local insights into the limits of medicine cannot add up to a single global limit to medicine, which is unknowable. We still can say that medical nemesis is systemic, though. It's just we cannot get a totalizing view of that. Thus, brief digression. Quite importantly, this pitfall that I mentioned is also somehow something which Illich predicted and warned us for. He warned us. In Medical Nemesis he lists a list of things we can do, of political actions, reforms that can be undertaken to challenge the radical monopoly of medicine, like empowering the patient, greater external scrutiny to the institution of medicine. But at the end of this list, he warns that if they become formulated sort of within the language of medicine as just as a singular fix for a very complex trajectory, they will only contribute to medical nemesis, even if they will situationally manage to reduce medicine's negative externalities. This seems quite important and prescient, as well, Illich's vision seems to have been largely realized. Patient activism, for instance, played a great role in empowering patients, in making them more autonomous in relations with the doctor, rather than just merely listening to what they have to say. It's opened up more ways of interacting with the medical profession, but simultaneously it has been largely marred by consumers, by just a push towards just demanding more and more treatment rather than freedom from treatment. Here I've got two papers. I'm citing them. The first one describes the reference to the NHS in the 80s and 90s, so what would come after Illich, and they were marked by a reduction of the autonomy of medicine at the micro level of in doctor-patient relationships, and the meso level of the medical profession's control over the institution of medicine, as well. There was a vast introduction of clinical audits, of more managerialization of the NHS, so external scrutiny. But nevertheless, they conclude that at the macro level, at the level of the episteme, once again, the biomedical model is only more pronounced and embedded. Ultimately, they also remarked that these reforms, although they indeed managed to improve the functioning of medicine, for instance, by disciplining poor practitioners and giving more scrutiny into the clinical outcomes of various doctors, because they were framed in a technocratic rhetoric that we have to optimize the resources. It kind of fitted the discourse that, yeah, well, the demand for healthcare is increasing, but obviously because we're neoliberals, we don't want to pay too much. We didn't want to fund too much from healthcare from the public sector. We want to cut welfare expenditures, so we don't. We actually are able to withhold the current demands for healthcare. We'll just optimize what we've got. Don't worry, everything will just get optimized, and that also creates a seemingly bottomless pit from which we can take, only furthering medical nemesis. Also, Conrad does ascertain. Peter Conrad is one of the chief sociologists of medicalization, and in his article, Shifting Edges of Medicalization, he notes that the role of doctors and of the institution of medicine in medicalization has actually much decreased. Nowadays, doctors, they do play an important role. They are the gatekeepers to medicine, but now the chief the shifting engines of medicalization are mainly run by big pharma, interests of capital, advertisements, which create further demand for health. So that's also maybe one way in which aims to fight back medical nemesis might backfire. Thus, it is pretty ironic that Shamish Mahani, who has been named the most radical criticism of medicine since Ivan Illich, is a doctor and is quite nostalgic about the times in the 70s when doctors were respected and patients would listen to the doctors. It's not as simple as that. He adopts a more critical perspective, but it's like it's an internal critique. He speaks from the perspective of a doctor, and he's well aware of that. But that's an interesting zeitgeist for me. So how do we break away from medical nemesis? Well, the thing is that although the healthcare service in the national health might be indeed depicted as a ubiquitous and powerful bureaucratic monolith, even the constrained space of the hospital ward has multiple niches. It's not totalized by medical nemesis, even if it's got an immense presence there. Even an elaborate network, such as the institution of medicine, remains local at all points, as the consistency of medicine relies on the constant local enactment of its ritual, the examination of patients, reading and rereading of medical records, and so on and so forth. Thus, well, it turns out that sometimes these networks have pores, which can be exploited by patients and doctors, which can maybe bypass the logic, the law of medicine, the law that the institution bestows, and that's also well depicted in the film. For instance, when one such niche where the medical gaze doesn't reach is exploited by one of the nurses who sells alcohol to an alcoholic patient. But nevertheless, despite the existence of such niches, medicine still has an immense presence in the national health. And very often it's it's well depicted that it's asserts this presence through particular enactments, but nevertheless has a presence. It's well depicted in the scene when okay, never mind. I think I haven't got enough time, so I'll skip it. Basically, every Oedipal relation offers a line of flight to become something else, and I believe that's what one of the characters, Ash, succeeds at. He's perhaps the only character to change profoundly throughout the course of the film and play. He is a former teacher who's been relegated to do menial clerical work. Thus, we know that he's got quite significant material and social capital. We know that he sent his adopted son to a super duper private school. He's got a suspicious interest in underage boys. That's a curiosity. But nevertheless, he's pretty estranged from his relationships. He's divorced, and his adopted boy doesn't contact him, so it's much harder for him to identify with them. In contrast to Foster, who still has these relationships, he can still get Oedipalized by them. By contrast, yeah, he also tries to orient himself by referring to his boy, to his work, and so on and so forth. But this projection seems to fall apart partly by his disease. Speaking of which, his disease progression seems quite interesting. He suffers from a gastric ulcer, which I think is quite significant, as at this time it was a disease solely associated with stress, with so something psychogenic. And this gastric ulcer, although seems a trivial ailment at first, it progresses quite significantly so that he needs a gastrectomy. He needs part of his stomach to be removed. Actually, I think it was a duodenum, but that's clinical details. And thus, by the fact that he has, unlike Foster, who hopes that for a restitution narrative of illness, that well, there was some state of normal state, then there came illness, which was a temporary interruption, but so that everything can go back to this very normal state. Ash cannot quite do this. He become the previous links which determined him, which constituted him, become severed, which initially is a source of some neurotic fixations. Very often he might be remarked for some phrases that he repeats all the time, as if he try to cling something certain in times of uncertainty. But he's remarkable perhaps in that he actively seems to go beyond whom he is. He interacts with patients very often, tries to he doesn't really try to affirm any vision of himself in particular, but rather he actually actively questions them. When Mackie speaks of his problematic ideas, he does rightfully criticize them. But when Foster treats Mackie with absolutely no respect, he nevertheless remarks that his positions are quite well embodied in his situation, in both his health, especially his health that he's with. So he actively seems to change change the territorialized the assemblage of which he is part, and which speaks through him. The assemblage which produces his enunciations. He's nevertheless interesting, as well, he clearly seems to embody and a sort of aristocratic ethos, that there are certain values that have to be preserved. At the very end of the film, he talks. He says practically a monologue about how it's important to speak a proper English and have good manners, but simultaneously, he's remarkable for how open he is in his behavior, and so that's also an interesting trope. I think it can lead to very interesting reflections from maybe a Nietzschean perspective. And the final of the show is that, well, the telenovela plotline is resolved with a happy ending. As we can see, everyone gets married and lives happy ever after, whereas the main plotline ends with a very normal ending. The patients which manage to survive just get sent back home, and these two plotlines are kind of intertwined with each other. At the very end, you get shots from one plotline and from the other, while in the meantime, there is a monologue of Ash, our protagonist, who at one point says, "We're all the same. We all need something fine to aspire. We want to rise, not sink in a bog." But interestingly, I would say that it might be a critique more aimed at the fantasy, that the technological fantasy of going beyond all limits of nature, which would render nature completely pliable, plastic through a series of equivalents. In that aspect, it will make us all the same. It is in the telenovela that everyone is the same. Even the nurses seems to represent the mentality of the upper middle class, behave like them, and so on and so forth. So, where by contrast, it is the wards of the hospital where absurds happen, where the limits of nature, and kind of just the configurations of society just the sheer absurdity of structures that just materialized immanently is brought into being. It is particular precisely in the socialized healthcare system that we are able to reach the limit of our health and critically reflect upon it. Indeed, Ivan Illich asserted that if it is only a socialized healthcare system that can kind of contain medical nemesis. Initially, he actually praised the NHS in like the 50s for basically for keeping a cap on the demand of medicine and also ensuring that is justly distributed. So I'm not sure if that's a coherent conclusion, but during this, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that I encouraged you to get familiarized with Peter Nichols's drama or the film adaptations of his drama. Any questions?